Robbie Lawler is one of the biggest savages to ever compete in the sport. He's an animal.
Well, Robbie's trying to disguise his punches. Look at that. Look at these guys. How about this?
Robbie Lawler wasn't your usual clean-cut champion. He was the most violent champion the UFC has ever seen. A fighter who turned the Octagon into a war zone nearly every time he stepped in it. His title fights weren't just victories, they were brutal masterpieces of heart and determination. From a teenage prodigy training with the best to becoming the most violent champion in MMA history, his journey is nothing short of epic. This is the story of Ruthless Robbie Lawler, the man who turned fighting into an art of pure grit and fury. Robbie Lawler's path to MMA greatness didn't start in a big city or under the bright lights of Vegas. Nope, this journey began in Bettendorf, Iowa, a small, gritty Midwestern town where toughness is practically a way of life. Robbie moved to Bettendorf as a kid and quickly stood out. Whether it was football or wrestling, this guy had a knack for anything that let him hit hard and compete. But he wasn't just your typical athletic kid. Even as a teenager, people noticed something different about Robbie. He didn't just play sports, he attacked them. That intensity, that was just who he was. At 16, Robbie found his way to Militich Fighting Systems, the legendary gym founded by MMA pioneer Pat Militich. For a young fighter, stepping into MFS was like walking into the lion's den. The place was crawling with future champions like Matt Hughes and Tim Sylvia. If you wanted to survive there, let alone thrive, you had to bring it every single day. And boy, did Robbie bring it. Pat Militich saw the raw power and fearlessness in Robbie from day one. This kid wasn't just swinging for the fences, he was swinging to knock down walls. Under Militich's guidance, Robbie started to transform. He was no longer just a scrappy kid. He was becoming a fighter with the toughness and skill to hang with the best. At just 20 years old, Robbie made his UFC debut in 2002. Nobody really knew what to expect, but it didn't take long for him to show the world what he was about. In his first fight against Aaron Riley, Robbie went full throttle, unleashing the kind of aggression that would later become his calling card. He wasn't there to play it safe or feel his opponent out. He was there to throw bombs. That fight ended in a decision. But make no mistake, Robbie had arrived. Fans knew they were watching someone special. He wasn't just another fighter. He was a brawler, a knockout artist, and someone who didn't care about playing it safe. Robbie Lawler was here to make an impression, and he did exactly that. As explosive as Robbie's rise was, it wasn't all smooth sailing. His aggressive style made him a fan favorite, but it also left him open to counters and mistakes. Losses started piling up, and by 2004, Robbie found himself out of the UFC. For a young fighter with so much promise, it was a tough blow. But Robbie didn't throw in the towel. Instead, he hit the reset button. He spent the next few years grinding it out in smaller promotions like Elite XC and Strikeforce. These weren't glamorous days, but they were necessary. Robbie wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting to grow, to evolve. During this time, Robbie learned to temper his aggression with strategy. He didn't lose that trademark ferocity, but he started fighting smarter, using his power more effectively. By the time he joined Strikeforce in 2009, he wasn't just a brawler anymore. He was a more complete fighter, still dangerous, but now with a sharper edge. In 2013, Robbie Lawler came back to the UFC, and fans weren't quite sure what to expect. Was he still the same guy? Could he hang with the new generation of fighters? Turns out the answer was a resounding yes. Robbie's first fight back was against Josh Koscheck, a seasoned vet who wasn't going to give him an easy ride. But Robbie was ice cold, patient, calculated, and then, bam, he landed a vicious flurry that left Koscheck out cold. From that point on, it was full steam ahead. Robbie went on a tear, racking up wins and reminding everyone why his nickname was Ruthless. But the fight that truly cemented his legacy, that would be his war with Rory MacDonald at UFC 189. For 5 brutal rounds, Robbie and Rory traded bombs. By the end, both men were barely standing. But Robbie, he just wouldn't quit. When the dust settled, his hand was raised and fans were left in awe. This wasn't just a fight, it was an all-time classic. Alright, so by this point, Robbie Lawler is back in the UFC and he's making noise. He's not just winning, he's dominating, reminding everyone what Ruthless Lawler is all about. But to get that title, he has got to go through Johny Hendricks, the reigning champion known for his wrestling and knockout power. Hendricks was a beast, a guy with a heavy left hand that could turn anyone's lights out, and everyone knew this fight was going to be a war. Their first fight was everything that you would expect, an all-out brawl. Both guys were throwing bombs, testing each other's endurance, toughness, and heart. Hendricks took the early rounds with his wrestling, but Robbie came storming back, pushing the pace in the later rounds and making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. The crowd was on their feet, watching these two warriors give it all they had. But when the final bell rang, the judges gave it to Hendricks by a razor-thin decision. It was close, controversial even, and it left Robbie more determined than ever to get that belt. So, they did it again. In the rematch, Robbie wasn't just fighting for the belt, he was fighting to prove something. This time, he came in with an even more focused, relentless approach. The first 4 rounds were intense, but that 5th round, Robbie turned into a machine. He unleashed a flurry of strikes on Hendricks, showing everyone why he was called Ruthless. This time, the judges saw it Robbie's way, and he walked out of the Octagon as the welterweight champion of the world. And just like that, Robbie Lawler was on top, but he wasn't planning to be one of those champs who sits back. Oh no, Robbies Reign would be marked by violence, heart, and a willingness to engage in some of the most brutal wars MMA has ever seen. When people talk about the greatest fights in MMA history, Lawler versus MacDonald 2 is always in that conversation. Their first fight had been a gritty affair, with Robbie winning by decision. But this rematch? It was a whole new level of intensity. Rory MacDonald was a young, skilled fighter with a technical edge and a hunger to dethrone Robbie. And Robbie, he was the reigning champ who refused to give an inch. The fight started with both men testing each other, looking for openings. But by the second round, it was clear this was going to be a bloodbath. Rory broke Robbie's nose, and the blood started flowing. Both men were getting battered, but they kept pushing forward. Every time it seemed like one of them was gaining an edge, the other would come roaring back. By the 4th round, both men were covered in blood. Rory's nose was shattered, his face was swollen, and Robbie's lip was split so wide it was barely hanging on. And then as the bell rang to end the round, Robbie did something unforgettable. He stood there, looking right into Rory's eyes with blood pouring down his face, and gave him that cold, unbreakable stare. No words, just pure intensity. When the 5th round started, it was like a switch flipped in Robbie. He went after Rory with everything he had left. He threw a combination that finally broke Rory's spirit and Rory collapsed. The ref stepped in and Robbie raised his hands in victory, bloodied but triumphant. It was a moment that defined his career. He had been through hell and back, and he'd come out of the other side still swinging. This fight turned Robbie into a legend.
Both guys unbelievably hurt. Robbie Lawler's lip, if you could have been in the Octagon and saw this lip, he would talk and this part of the lip would move and the other part wouldn't. What's his name nose was broken. Rory got out back. They said what year is it? He didn't know what year it was.
How are you feeling physically?
I feel great, just hanging out.
That fight against MacDonald wasn't just another victory. It was a turning point. The damage that both men absorbed that night would change them forever. And for Robbie, it was just one battle and a career full of wars that would exact a devastating toll. Here's the thing. You can't fight like Robbie Lawler without paying a price. You can't go through wars like the MacDonald fight without leaving pieces of yourself in the octagon. Every exchange, every brutal battle, carved another mark into Robbie's body and mind. After the MacDonald War, the damage became visible. His face, once unmarked, now carried the roadmap of his battles. His lip, split multiple times, never quite healed the same. His hands, from years of landing bombs, needed constant repair. But Robbie wore these marks like badges of honor, each scar telling the story of another legendary fight. The physical toll was obvious, but it was a hidden cost that really added up. The training camps got harder, recovery took longer. The sparring sessions that once energized him now drained him. Yet even as his body showed signs of breaking down, Robbie's spirit remained unbreakable, which makes what happened next even more remarkable. Just when fans thought Robbie couldn't top his fight with Rory, he went toe-to-toe with Carlos Condit. Condit was known for his wild, unorthodox striking, and both men were looking to prove who was the real king of the welterweights. This fight was a barn burner from start to finish, a chess match mixed with pure aggression. For 5 rounds, Robbie and Carlos traded shots, each landing blows that would have stopped lesser fighters. The pace was relentless. In the final round, with everything on the line, Robbie dug deep. He let his hands fly, showing the world what it looked like to be ruthless in every sense of the word. When the final bell rang, both men were exhausted, battered, and barely standing. Robbie edged out the win by split decision, but the fight took a heavy toll on him. With every title defense, Robbie was pushing himself further than ever before. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting his own limits, his own pain threshold, and fans were watching in awe as he continued to defy the odds. So, what was it that made Robbie Lawler so different? It wasn't just his power or his chin, although those were definitely a part of it. No, Robbie had something else, something intangible. He had an intensity, a fighter that few fighters could match. When he stepped into the octagon, he brought a level of focus and determination that left opponents shaking. There's something about that look Robbie gave his opponents, that mean mug, the cold, unflinching stare he'd flash right before the fight. It was a look that said, "I'm here to fight, and I'm not going anywhere." He didn't need to trash talk or psych out his opponents. He let his fists do the talking. That stare became legendary, a reminder of the unbreakable will that fueled every punch he threw. And then there was his ability to walk through shots. Robbie could take punishment like few others. He absorbed hits that would put most fighters on the mat, and he'd keep coming forward. It wasn't just his chin, it was his mental toughness, his refusal to break. For Robbie, every punch he took was just fuel for the fire. It was like he thrived on the chaos, the uncertainty, the grit of a tough fight. If you want to understand Robbie Lawler, just watch him in the 5th round, when most fighters would be gassed, desperate to survive until the bell. Robbie would come alive. He had this unique ability to dig deep, to find another gear when the fight was on the line. It was almost like he got stronger as the fight went on. He'd reach down, find that extra burst of energy, and push forward, no matter how tired, no matter how hurt. His 5th round intensity was legendary, and it was a huge part of what made him such a beloved champion. Fans knew that no matter what happened in the first 4 rounds, if the fight went to the 5th, Robbie would be there, still throwing, still fighting with everything he had. When Robbie fought, he put his opponents under constant pressure. He'd push forward, cut off the cage, and force them to engage. And once they were trapped, he'd unload with vicious combinations that left them scrambling. But it wasn't just physical pressure, it was mental. Opponents knew that Robbie wouldn't break, that he'd keep coming no matter what. Fighting Robbie Lawler was as much a test of heart as it was of skill. For his opponents, it was exhausting. They'd throw their best shots, hit him clean, but Robbie would just keep coming, staring them down with that unflinching look. It was intimidating, a reminder that they were up against someone who wasn't just there to win, he was there to break them. Robbie Lawler's career wasn't just about belts or knockouts. It was about making every fight unforgettable. In a sport packed with killers, Robbie stood out because he didn't just fight. He went to war. Every time he walked into the Octagon, fans knew they were in for a blood-soaked spectacle that would leave jaws on the floor. During his reign as champ, Robbie set the gold standard for violence. His wars with Johny Hendricks, Rory MacDonald, and Carlos Condit weren't just title defenses. They were savage battles that pushed the limits of what fighters could endure. Robbie didn't fight to outpoint his opponents. He fought to break them, to leave no doubt about who the toughest guy in the room was. But Robbie's story wasn't just about brutality. It was about heart. He wasn't perfect, far from it. He had setbacks, tough losses, and moments when people thought he was done. But Robbie always came back stronger, proving time and time again that champions are not defined by their wins, they're defined by their resilience. And let's not forget the respect he earned. Fighters who faced Robbie came out with more than just bruises. They came out with stories of his unrelenting pressure, insane durability, and that signature ruthless intensity. Robbie didn't need trash talk or theatrics. His fist did all the talking. After 44 professional fights, 20 years of wars, and countless scars, Robbie Lawler had one last battle ahead of him. For most fighters, their final performance is a sad reminder of their fading glory. But Robbie, he was about to remind everyone why they called him Ruthless. Facing Nico Price, a younger, hungrier fighter known for wild knockouts, many thought Robbie was being fed to the wolves. This was supposed to be the passing of the torch, another veteran sent into retirement by the new generation. But in just 38 seconds, Robbie turned back time. The same devastating power that made him champion, the same killer instinct that defined his career, exploded one final time. As Price crumbled under a brutal flurry of strikes, the crowd erupted. In his last dance, Robbie Lawler hadn't just won. He had authored the perfect ending to a violent fairy tale. Standing in the Octagon one last time, blood mixed with sweat, Robbie didn't need any dramatic speeches. His fists had done all the talking, just like they always had.
Saturday is Robbie's last fight in the UFC. So I'm curious, how would you sum up his career in the UFC?
Yeah, he and I were just talking in the back. You know, he's been here since he was 19 years old. He's going to be 42 pretty soon. That's a hell of a career. He's been in a lot of wars. He's held titles. He's had a pretty special career. And, you know, looking forward to Saturday and not looking forward to Saturday. We love him and we wish him all the best in the rest of his life after Saturday.